everybody. We have seen we have more than 500 participants. That is very, very good, and I hope you can all stay until the very end of this seminar. My name is Axel Berkowski. I'm from the University of Pavia in Italy. So best wishes from Italy. We've got very nice weather here today, and I hope the same is true where you are. Today's seminar is titled COVID-19 and International Trade, which is yet another seminar of the EU-Japan COVID-19 webinar series. Of course, trade, you're all aware of this, is a very urgent and pressing issue at the time, at this time of the COVID-19 crisis. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, for example, is estimating that global FDI could be down by up to 40% this year. It's an estimate, maybe it's still early days, but as far as the UN Conference on Trade and Development is concerned, FDI will go down significantly in 2020 and probably also beyond 2020. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, on the other hand, estimates that global trade flow will be down by up to 30%. There are some estimates that say this is too pessimistic, and it depends also on the quality of the crisis and how quickly trade will be able to recover. But let's say it will go down significantly, and let's say for the sake of the argument, it will be between 20 and 30% this year. There has been a lot of talk about reducing dependence on China as a trading partner, configuring supply chains, onshoring, and so on and so forth. This all sounds very good. It sounds all very creative, but we must not forget, and we will of course talk about this in the seminar also today, that this is all very time consuming and costly. So you cannot easily reconfigure a chain or change supply chains. This is taking not weeks or months, but this is taking years. So there's of course no silver bullet for how to get out of this mess, essentially. Today, however, we will have a panel of very qualified panelists. We have two policymakers, two officials, one from Europe, and I will introduce them as we go along when they start the presentations, and one scholar and one business consultant. Okay, highly qualified panelists, and they have promised to be brilliant and to be very eloquent, and I'm sure they will keep their promise. And you know, I can promise you this: these people really know what they are talking about, and they will present 10 to 12 minutes. There will be ample space for Q&A afterwards. I will throw in a couple of questions. Then it's of course over to you, and you can also, and this is another reminder for you, and of course you are familiar with this, you can also write your questions in the chat. Right? I will try to pick up as many questions as possible. I cannot promise to pick up all the questions, which of course is always impossible, also in view of the fact that we are so many here today, which of course I'm very happy about. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'll read out the semi-official introduction of this seminar series to explain to you the rationale and the background of this seminar. In other words, why are we doing this? Who do we want to reach? And what do we want to achieve? And when I say we, is of course the European Union. And this is a project initiated and sponsored by the European Union. And I think it is a very, very useful exercise on getting the voices out there, right? And in cooperation, of course, with our Japanese partners in the context of this very solid and continuously strengthening EU-Japan partnership. Now, so over to myself for 2 minutes, and then I'll be silent, not for the rest of the seminar, but at least for a while. The EU and Japan are strategic partners sharing the same, or indeed very similar approaches towards global politics, economics, and security. The result of this closeness, an active and indeed very ambitious level of cooperation, are the Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA, and the Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, Both agreements were adopted in 2019. The SPA defines the level and quality of political and security relations and interactions. The EPA, of course, as you know, is dealing with economic and trade relations. Right? Both agreements aim at more and more concrete EU-Japan action on the ground, and I'm sure we will talk about how this can be realized in the field of trade. In times of crisis, like the times you are living in now, the SPA and the EPA as instruments to coordinate action in global politics and economics and trade become even more important. Right? That's, of course, very obvious. In fact, the crisis is the agreement's first test case, if you will, although I'm sure we all agree that this is the test we would have liked to do without. Of course, the EPA and the SPA would have been important even without the crisis, but now they have even become more important. And just how much important they have become will be discussed today. I'm wrapping up. This virtual forum provides a space to exchange information and views about the EU and Japan responses to the crisis, and to discuss ideas for enhancing EU-Japan cooperation in the context created by the new virus. And there's, of course, also something that's addressed to you as the audience. The seminar series kicked off in June with a discussion on COVID-19 and green recovery. Recovery policies must focus on rebuilding robust, sustainable, inclusive, and resilient economies in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Recovery planning must be put at the center, the decarbonization of the economy, digital transformation, and the virtuous cycle of environment and growth. In today's webinar on COVID-19 and international trade, we will discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on global trade and how it can contribute to a green recovery by addressing topics such as building resilient supply chains, strategic production, and reviving the multilateral trade system. So we are taking a very, very positive approach to this. We think this is, of course, a serious crisis, and all of us are aware of this, but we also see this as an opportunity for green or greener recovery. Now, this is it for me for the time being. I would like to introduce you to our first speaker. That's Ms. Stephanie Leupold, Head of Unit Trade Planning, DG Trade, European Commission in Brussels. Welcome to you, Stephanie. Thank you very much for joining us today. Again, you have the task to be brilliant and eloquent, and to set the standards for the rest of the panelists. Over to you. And I will let you know in 10 or 12 minutes whether you met that requirement. No, I'm only joking. I'm sure you are brilliant by nature, and the floor is yours now. Over to you.
Yes. Good morning from Brussels. Thank you, Axel. Good afternoon to those of you in Tokyo. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would have obviously very much preferred to be rather in Tokyo now, looking forward to the opening of the Olympic Games, but I guess it just shows as much as we're living in unprecedented times, how much uncertainty all this crisis has put on us. And I will not repeat what Axel already said about the impact that this has, not just on health and our lives, but also on the economy. And I very much appreciate actually this opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity, this webinar, to bring us all together in a, I'd say, emission-free manner to draw jointly lessons from the crisis, and also look at what we can do in cooperation between the EU and Japan. As we are several speakers, I decided to maybe focus on the European perspective, to give you a bit on the European response as a background then for our ensuing discussion. And I can already promise that all the examples I will take will actually show ample room for further cooperation globally, but also in particular with like-minded partners like Japan. So I will focus my intervention on, I think, three issues or three phases. First, the EU's response or reaction to the immediate health crisis. Then the ongoing, I would say, support to the recovery of the economy. And last but not least, I would like to briefly touch upon the review of our trade policy that we have just launched, that Commissioner Hogan has launched, and which basically aims at setting the right trade policy for the new normal, as we would then call it, and as we're hoping for it to start. So let me start first with the EU's reaction to the immediate health crisis. I think not very surprisingly, and as many, or probably all governments worldwide, I think the reaction of the EU was also first to turn inwards. I mean, this was a health crisis, it was about life and death. So governments focused very much on survival, providing essential goods and services to their population, and intervening directly in the production and the distribution of those products and services. What the EU focused on then was trying to keep at least the internal market, or a single market between the 27 member states intact, as member states had started first to resurrect barriers that we didn't know anymore, borders between the member states, something very shocking in particular in the beginning for our Italian friends who felt very much left alone when the crisis was in full swing over there. So what the EU did is we did establish an export authorization scheme at EU level in order to replace the different national measures and to at least keep a harmonized approach over the single market. This, I think, was a reaction to obviously the fact that there was a global shortage in those products. We had seen that we cannot leave it to market forces. Basically, when we know that there's a shortage, we need to ensure that the products go where they're needed most. And it's clear that this global shortage, I mean, has certainly exposed us to vulnerabilities. Axel already mentioned the supply chains, resilience of supply chains. So we saw that all of a sudden we were dependent maybe on products entering the country from elsewhere. But we were just basically a little bit under shock from this shortage, and there was a panic buying, governments almost outbidding each other and so on. I think what this example though shows is that it's very important to clearly define the problem, analyze it on the basis of solid data and facts before we come up with a policy response. Because if you get the problem definition wrong, you're very likely to get the policy response wrong. And I'm afraid to say, or I'm at least not afraid to say, that I think here we did make an error. You know, we reacted to this global shortage by resurrecting barriers and by having this export authorization scheme, where at the end what we would have needed is global cooperation, keeping supply chains open in order to ramp up international production effectively. There was just not enough production overall. So we needed to ramp it up. And that is only possible if you have a stable, open trading environment. So we actually got it wrong. We didn't look sufficiently at the problem definition, and we got the policy response wrong. This being said, I'm glad to say that we learned from the mistakes. We immediately turned towards global cooperation in the G20 with the WTO. We made a commitment to these measures being as targeted as possible, being temporary, being transparent. And I'm glad to be able to say that then we phased out the EU's regime by the end of May. So I think that maybe as a very first example from this first immediate health crisis reaction, how important it is to really look in particular. Axel, you said it, there's lots of calls for reshoring, onshoring, domestic production, and so on. It is very important here to not engage in the wrong political rhetoric. I think we all know here among the trade experts the benefits of openness, the benefits of interconnected global value chains. And not least, the OECD has recently come out with an analysis as well, which clearly shows that actually the more you're interconnected, probably the more resilient you will be. Or let's put it, the more you will rely on domestic production only, the more vulnerable you might actually be. So that may be as my first part. The second one, the EU's response now in the recovery phase. So what is the EU doing to support the recovery of its economy? It's obviously very clear that the focus right now is on a fiscal stimulus. That's the same all around the world. Whoever has money in their pockets is now trying to hand that money out in order to get companies restarted, because it's obviously been a tremendous suffering, in particular for SMEs, but also for the larger companies. We see that they are under tremendous stress. We've put therefore some flexibility on our state aid regime on a temporary basis in that first phase. And the Commission has proposed a recovery instrument, which is not about trade, but which I would like to highlight because it's quite unprecedented, I would say, in its scope and in its method. In its scope, that it's 750 billion euros, but in particular that it will allow the Commission to be tapping into the financial markets for the first time and be borrowing money. I think is the very new quality of this instrument. But trade policy obviously is also a very important tool we know in the recovery. We've seen this after the global financial crisis of 2009, that preventing protectionism, preventing a protectionist negative spiral and keeping markets open was extremely important for the recovery. We depend on trade, not just for exports, for imports, but also for continued competitiveness and for further innovation. So it would be really the wrong lesson from the crisis to turn inwards and to close. So we very much believe that we need a strong and a good, the right trade policy to create the right framework to make sure that the stimulus packages that are being dispersed now actually have a long-term and sustainable effect. One point I would like to mention here is precisely on these subsidies, because I think this will be one of the focus of a new risk of protectionism. It will be maybe less the classical protectionism, although we know some like tariffs, but obviously the subsidies that are now being put out everywhere, but with very different means. I mean, we know that not all economies have the same means of doing so, will be very important that we set the right framework for those as well, in order to be sure that for the new normal, we return to a market-driven economy, that we return to a level playing field. That is very important for the EU for its internal market, where we have much benefited from fair competition, but it's also at the same level very important globally. And we know we had already a Japanese-US cooperation. We call it the trilateral discussions for new disciplines on industrial subsidies. I think this project is maybe not at the forefront right now, where we're all trying to look at subsidizing and restarting our economy, but it's very clear that it's a very important project for the longer term. So getting it there right, making sure the subsidies go where they are needed, where we have market failures, but not those that are trade distorting, will be an important part for the recovery. And if you allow, Axel, if I can just finish with a short word then on our preparations more long term for the new normal, because I think that's another important lesson. I mean, the immediate crisis is certainly not a good advisor. We should learn from it, but it's not good. It's not a good advice to then devise your long-term policies maybe on that immediate crisis reaction. So the Commissioner also wary of the fact that the COVID crisis has actually accelerated several other pre-crisis trends, I would say, like further economic nationalism, inward-looking protectionism, unilateral measures. We're talking a lot about decoupling, the reshoring. So there's lots of this market state intervention in the market. All these trends that were already there before the crisis have been accelerated and do change the world in which we're living. And in particular, unfortunately, they weaken the global governance structures. That in particular as a EU, we have very much been supporting and relying on, and that we will make a priority to try to resurrect, safeguard and reform. So with that in mind, the Commissioner has decided to launch a review of our trade policy in order to make it fit for the next phase of globalization. I don't believe that we're going away from globalization, but we maybe have a chance here to shape that next phase in a way that is very much in line with our values and interests. And for that, we have now launched a public consultation, and we will come out then with a new strategy towards the end of the year. What you probably have already seen is, and some were wondering whether it's just a buzzword or a real concept, we have put at the heart of that review the concept of open strategic autonomy. And maybe just one word, and I'm happy to say more about that in the questions and answers, but it's just trying to make a clear statement that when we're talking about strategic autonomy and resilience, it does not mean that we're planning to do this alone. We very much believe in the strengths of openness, of international cooperation, and I think the EU-Japan cooperation is a very clear example of a strong alliance between like-minded partners, and we will rather want to use this openness and our also leadership in the multilateral sphere to rebuild those global governance structures that I think we have seen in this crisis are needed so much. So maybe let me just finish by really saying, as much as the crisis has certainly fueled further anti-globalization sentiments, and it is certain that globalization has not only had positive impacts, certainly, but it also has probably not caused this crisis, and deglobalization will not solve it. So more than ever, we believe that international cooperation is important here, and I'm looking forward to further discuss with you on how we can use the EU-Japan alliance, particularly to strengthen that. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much for your presentation. There are already questions coming in the Q&A and in the chat function. They are directed to you, Stephanie, but also others. And again, thank you very much for kicking us off so nicely. This is there's a lot of food for thought, a lot of issues we come back to later on. I will not address any other questions now. I will not pose a question. I will move on to our second speaker today, Mr. Hossok Lee Makiyama, the director of the European Center for International Political Economy, also in Brussels. Welcome to you again. Hossok is, if you will, is sort of the European shooting star on international trade. Whenever you look into, whenever you look up the internet on EU-Japan trade and related issues, you will find his name. He's all over the place. He's very good. That's why he is here. That's why he is here today. Hossok, the floor is yours. 12 minutes. If you can limit it to 12 minutes, and then we move along. Hossok, over to you. You're still there, right? You're not on a plane yet.
Indeed.
Okay, good.
I haven't retired yet. I still have 5-7 years to go, but it's frightening to know that I'm still just a shooting star. Thank you so much for your very kind words, Axel. I will actually continue on very much in the same line as Stephanie so expertly laid out, because I think my views are very, very similar to hers. So I will perhaps realign some of my speaking points to what it actually means. And I would start on the state of our economy that also Axel pointed out, that we are looking at a very steep or sudden stop on the world economy. And I have to be quite harsh and say that the world economy outlook is actually even worse than it looks. IMF has downgraded the growth prospect of Japan to -6% in GDP. Eurozone has actually suffered even worse, to 10.2% drop, -10.2%. And this is actually even 3 percentage points lower than in April. So we are now seeing gradual downgrade of the economic state. And if you look at the global economy as a whole, the whole economy will basically wipe out $6 trillion US. And that's equivalent to a G7 country disappearing, actually 2 G7 countries disappearing from the planet. This is so far where we are now. But we need to also be very blunt and say that the recovery is probably going to be delayed. There are still a number of factors of uncertainty across all regions. We are still possibly facing second and third waves of infections. We are looking at the secondary impact on equity markets of the prices of stock and assets dropping, and commodity prices has already started to fall. And we need to also be cautious about the impact on the emerging markets. I'm thinking about Brazil and India that are important growth markets, not least for Japan. We are maybe looking at a major debt crunch in these emerging markets. And so far, COVID-19 has actually only affected relatively resourceful and rich countries that can afford basic sanitation and PPEs. So my conclusion of this is actually that we have immediately dealt with the first crisis, which is the pandemic itself, but actually the economic crisis is still to be solved. And wherever COVID-19 has gone, it has actually posed problems that are unique to each country, since pandemic seems to actually just amplify the existing problems. And in the US, we have seen the pandemic lay bare the shortcomings of the healthcare system in the US, as well as, if I may say, the obvious nature of its political leadership. In Japan, we have seen a very impressive and fast and resolute response in terms of immediate stimulus package that is probably the biggest that we have seen in the world in modern history. We are looking at a quarter of country's GDP and 1/3 going to small businesses and household, but also it adds up to the existing debt, which will now probably reach 300%. And in EU, I can only reiterate what Stephanie has said here, that the EU quickly descended into what we can call an internal war. France went after seizing medical shipments en route to Italian hospitals. And we still have political disunity around corona bonds. I dare to say that without the European Union, our worst instincts came out in a matter of days. We started actually to kill each other. And this is the cost of non-Europe. And we saw it within days. And the truth is that there's no country, neither rich nor poor, was really well equipped to deal with the shocks, and especially in trade, of a pandemic of today's scale. And if I told you that there's going to be a major impact on GDP and output, I have to unfortunately say that the impact on global trade is going to be disproportionately high. We are looking at, according to IMF, and I think this is actually a relatively reasonable number, that we have seen, we will see a shrink of international trade of -12%. Mostly due to severe demand contractions as industry and consumers stop spending money, but also lack of supplies and transports. And we have also received already in the Q&A that people are interested in buying European machinery, but they cannot get the engineers in to actually install them. That means no sale. And I would like to offer a little bit of a bigger historical perspective of what it actually means. And I would like to reiterate that we were already at a very low benchmark when it comes to international trade. International trade did not recover fully from the Lehman shock and the Euro crisis of 2010 until last year. It took 9 years to recover from that crisis. And we had just recovered when COVID-19 hit us. And the worst hit, of course, the complex value chain industries like electronics, household capital goods like cars, and also agriculture. It struck very unevenly across different countries. Some have managed reasonably well. I am afraid to say that Europe is actually one of the worst affected. And this is the reason why the GDP impact on Europe is in many regards higher than other countries. And the truth is that export-led growth that we are talking about will not be on the table for a very, very long time, perhaps up to a decade. The macroeconomic fundamentals are basically not there to enable us to export ourselves out of the emergency of the crisis. The recovery will not be trade-led, and it will be a very slow, gradual growth back to previous levels, and it will not be driven by exports. And this is, of course, going to be a problem for countries that are extremely export dependent, countries like Germany, Scandinavia, Benelux, who has more than 50% of its GDP coming from exports. much less so perhaps for France, Italy, and Spain, and perhaps least so for countries like China, US, and Japan, whose GDP only a fraction of the GDP actually depends on exports. It's sometimes forgotten that actually France is more export dependent than China. And of course, it's mostly regional trade, but so is, of course, China and other countries. They most trade regionally. And therefore, this creates an extreme vulnerability to countries that have extremely high export GDP ratio, while the growth is not coming back through trade. And market response so far has been mainly one about diversification. We have different national plans, and we have the supply chain strategy of Japan coming out. I'm sure that diversification will be a part of the narrative when the Commission comes out with its trade communication. And I have to say that the market response is not really about onshoring and bringing back industry or offshoring back. Diversification basically means that you are going to spread your risk more evenly. So if you have been overexposed to the Chinese market, then you're onshoring. If underexposed to foreign markets, you are maybe bringing your factories out. And so far, the earliest signals seem to suggest that the investment and production capacities are actually moving away from Europe and to China, not vice versa. And there's a very natural reason for this. And this is actually quite frightening. It's because China was the first to go into the dark tunnel of COVID. And of course, it's the first to come out. It's quite striking that China is actually the only country that has not put a major stimulus package on the table because it doesn't have to. And this poses a common risk and a challenge to Europe and Japan. And I have to be very pessimistic of the projections in terms of if the economies will open up. I don't think so. I think I would even go as far as saying that we will be increasingly depending on where there are growth coming back quickly, like in the Chinese economy, but China is unlikely to open up. And Beijing is already going into a current account deficit. In other words, there's actually more money leaving China than coming in. So it will become even more protectionist. And put it very bluntly, they may not be interested in opening up to neither Japan or Europe, but to other countries which are of a higher priority. And for Europe, this dependency I talked about on trade is also a dependency on China. Germany invests 15 times more in China than they do in Japan. If you look at American investments, United States invests equally in Japan and China. You see this imbalance. This imbalance in the coming 2 years will go into a major transition. And going to the final point around what we can do together, of course, this over-concentration on few regions or countries and the supply chain vulnerabilities that we have discovered has to be addressed together. EU-Japan EPA, of course, is a major cornerstone in its development, and I would like to once again congratulate everyone who has been involved in the audience and in the panel. But there has to be more, and one of the opportunities is, of course, regions like Asean, where Japan has a natural lead that can offer similar kind of diversification in terms of labor capacity, know-how, combined with European and Japanese capital, can actually offer an alternative on our option to diversify our risks. And second point that we have in our agenda to better respond to COVID together, I think, is building on the leadership that we have created in trade. There is a trilateral forum of United States, Japan, and Europe that is working on trade. This could be easily replicated into industrial policy, building on the same framework we have to address trade and WTO management issues. We can coordinate on trade and industrial policy. Imagine if we could combine Japan's fiscal firepower with Europe's standard setting powers. I'm sure the United States may bring something on the table as well, although I'm struggling to figure out what it would be right now. Bilateral cooperation. EPA, I think for us, was not about new market access. Japan, Europe was sufficiently open already. It was an enabler to enhance a deeper dialogue. And one area is about greening our economies, joint R&D, new mechanism that can lead to a future, maybe a joint carbon-free trade area where we have no tariffs and no regulatory barriers and no carbon. And the fact is, EU has very few opportunities to grow aside from going inwards, because Europe is simply too big and there are no market opportunities right now that could actually bring Europe back to growth. We can only trust ourselves. Therefore, it would be beneficial for partners like Japan to be a part of that inward-looking perspective. So be a part of the solution already from the beginning, and this is what basically in EPA has enabled Japan to do, if I may say, the 28th member state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, 27 member states, by the way. You mentioned you're counting still the UK. But,
I was counting Japan as the 28th.
Ah, oh yeah. I mean, there's a spot open. There's an opening now. I mean, Japan is. I mean, you know, if it's not a geographical concept, then the Japanese friends, of course, very welcome.
That's what I mean. If we were looking inwards, it's better to be inside the circle, and this is what the EPA enable. I apologize for my unclear English. I'm even worse in Japanese.
It's all very good. No, I on the other hand would like to thank you very much for this very clear and very well formulated presentation. You certainly, I mean, of course, I think all of us here hope you're wrong on everything, because you sound really, you know, it's gloom and doom, but everything you have said is based on empirical evidence, and much of this of what you have said is it's of course very easily verifiable. But we still hope, of course, that some of what you said might not turn out to be as dramatic as you have presented. But I have the feeling that you could be right. And we will come back to you later on, and there are a number of questions also directed to you. The number of participants is not decreasing, it's increasing, right? So this is already a good sign. And it's also because of, well, it's because of all of us here. It's also because of our next speaker, and we stay in Brussels. It's Minister Okochi Akihiro. Good morning to you, morning to Brussels. Minister at the European Union, sorry, of the Japanese mission to the European Union in Brussels. Thank you very much for being here today, sharing your thoughts. Minister, you have to give us a silver lining. You have to be, give us some good news on how the European Union, this is following up on what Hosuk said in his last sentence, on how the European Union and Japan, through the EPA above all, can make a positive contribution to getting out of the crisis as quickly as possible. Over to you, Minister. You got 12 minutes or 13 if you want, and the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Okay. Well, Alex, thank you for your introduction. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about the effect of COVID-19 on international trade from the Japanese government perspective, but I'm sure many points are shared between Japanese and European perspectives, which are already elaborated by Stephanie and Maki. So next page, please. When considering international trade policy after the COVID-19 pandemic, let me first introduce an insightful comment made by a renowned economist that COVID-19 is similar to a stress test of economic activities in their entirety. The aim of the stress test is to examine what has worked smoothly even under enormous pressure, and to find vulnerable points that we should reinforce. So I'd like to apply this observation to international trade during this crisis. So next page, please. First, Which aspects have functioned well during the pandemic? Although there may be various answers to this question, I'd like to emphasize that economic ties between Japan and the EU overcame these challenging times without any major problems. This is remarkable, given that the EU's economic relations with some other countries have been going through an extremely tense period. The strong relationship between Japan and EU was further demonstrated during a productive leaders meeting held by video conference at the end of May. With regard to trade policy, leaders agreed upon the importance of keeping the trading system open by facilitating the flow of medical supplies and agricultural products, and of reforming and strengthening the WTO. It can be said that Japan and EU have successfully passed this stress test in the form of the COVID-19 crisis. So what has enabled this to happen? I'm sure that multi-layered cooperation between Japan and EU have prevented disturbances from taking place. In the bilateral context, as mentioned by Stephanie and Maki-san, we have the EPA, which has been in force for more than a year. In the plurilateral framework, the G7 and G20, as well as the trilateral ministerial meetings with the US, having effective frameworks for policy coordination. And finally, Japan and EU have been working together closely through global institutions such as the WTO. However, there may be a further reason for this success, which is the shift of the EU's trade policy towards a more geopolitical position. As for Japan, it has not been a secret that it keeps geopolitical considerations in mind when engaging in trade talks. For example, we have made it clear that the TPP agreement is not only an economic bond among its members, but also the means by which to spread our shared values, such as the rule of law, transparency, and fair competition. So we are pleased to see the EU embracing this attitude more clearly in its trade policy. For example, after the EU-China summit, President von der Leyen publicly requested China's commitments on the behavior of state-owned enterprises, as well as transparency in subsidies and first technology transfers. I believe this to be a step in the right direction. So as we have seen so far, multi-layered cooperation, as well as the shared values and geopolitical interests of Japan and the EU, should continue to serve as a solid basis for our economic cooperation after the COVID-19 crisis. So next page, please. Then, in which areas of the international trade system the vulnerabilities appear and how can we cope with them? Many countries and academics have been discussing this issue for months, and I feel that sufficient number of plans and actions have already been produced, such as the G20's ministerial statement and the statement of the Ottawa Group. However, I'd like to focus on 3 areas where Japan and the EU can together play an active role for a more resilient international trade system in the post-COVID-19 era. First, during the first stage of pandemic, some countries introduced export restriction measures on medical equipment and personal protection equipment, which caused disruptions to the global supply chain and created anxiety across many societies. Some academics compared these reactions by governments in global markets to panic buying by individual consumers in domestic markets. Enhanced transparency and the sharing of information can be the key to address this enduring challenge and will help dissipate groundless fears among governments and individuals. One priority will be to ensure transparency in the trade-related measures that governments have introduced to tackle this pandemic. Therefore, we should strictly implement the notification obligations required by the WTO and strengthen the notification system themselves. This will also help governments to keep their trade-related measures targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. Second, this online seminar itself clearly shows the value of digital communications, and many people point out that digital trade will play an increasingly essential role in global trade, especially after this pandemic. However, there are no common global rules in trade-related aspects of e-commerce, except a certain number of legal frameworks established through some regional trade agreements, including the TPP and the Japan-EU EPA. This shows the necessity of reinvigorating the debate on electronic commerce in the WTO, especially through the discussions under the joint statement initiatives on e-commerce. We also expect a swift start to the reassessment of the need for inclusion of provisions on the free flow of data in line with Article 8.81 of the Japan-EU EPA. And finally, history shows that great turmoil in the global economy has sometimes caused a state of ruthless competition based upon self-interest. To avoid such a state of turmoil under the law of the jungle, we will have to work together to ensure a level playing field in the global market, paying special attention to issues such as state subsidies and state-owned enterprises. The EU's negotiation of an investment treaty with China, as well as an early signing of the RCEP agreement, will be beneficial to ensuring such a level playing field. It is also essential to explore fundamental solutions on the issue of the appellate body of the WTO in order to avoid the law of the jungle governing our international trade policy. So I'd like to end here on a positive note that I expect Japan and EU to provide significant results to these challenges through our coordinated efforts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister, for ending on for your presentation, also ending on a very positive note. The questions are coming in. The number of participants is still very, very high. So thank you very much. Bear with all of us until the end. Minister, maybe we will come back to this later, but you also mentioned the EU-China bilateral investment agreement, which you said would be beneficial, you know, to make progress and try to create a level playing field. And we come back to this later, because as far as I can see, I mean, the Chinese are very interested in signing the agreement as quickly as possible, but there are still a lot of obstacles on the European side to the signing. And there are, of course, a number of very different opinions in China and on the EU on this. But we will come back to this later if we can. I'm sure we can. Last but not least, we have we're moving finally to Tokyo. We are welcoming Kobayashi Nobuko-san, partner and managing director at EY Parthenon in Tokyo consultancy. Nobuko-san, thank you very much for joining us today. Your CV is very impressive, as that I will not read it out here today. But you know, the audience, have a look at Kobayashi-san's CV. Very impressive, and I'm sure she will put some of this brilliance and experience at our disposal now in the next 12 minutes. Nobuko-san, over to you. You got 12 minutes to impress all of us. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Axel. So I will speak in English, and I'll try, my presentation is as good as my CV, but thank you very much for this opportunity. I have been engaged in the strategic consulting. So my previous speakers talked about the policy side from Brussels perspective. So changing the viewpoint, I would like to talk about this issue from the Japanese point of view. What I wanted to talk to you today is that the EU-Japan trade, what was the state before the COVID crisis, and what kind of impact COVID crisis has brought about, and the future outlook. And I think part of this was already covered by my previous speaker, so I will be brief. So especially what the companies are viewing this, especially when we think about the future, what is the impact on the supply chain? And so the reactions from the businesses, what the people are thinking about, what they are feeling about, and what are the Japanese policies. So I'd like to talk about them from the industrial standpoint. First of all, about the EU-Japan trade. As a baseline before COVID, it looks like a distant past, before COVID. After the ratification of the EPA for the 10 months, it was a 6.6% increase from the previous year, and from Japan to EU, the same 6.5%. And from EU to Japan, the beverages and food was among the most big increase, and from Japan to EU, automobiles and parts were among the goods which were the greatest greatest but that plummeted. As of May, the volume of trade plummeted by 30% between Japan and EU. On the other hand, in Japan, as well as with the entire world, it was 27% reduction. So that means that the slightly greater between Japan and EU than Japan and the rest of the world, because China was quick to recover, and China and the US are the two greatest trading partners for Japan. So the 27% reduction between Japan and the world, but between Japan and EU, because EU has suffered quite a long time from the COVID-19. So the result is that, and the supply chain issue. And you can see that there is this reduction. So what's the outlook for the economy? And Mr. Lee Makiyama talked about this a lot. When we talk about the outlook for Japan and EU, according to IMF, Japan minus 6%, and then on the EU side, minus 10% against the previous year. So if this situation continues as is, Japan will be a little bit faster than the EU in overcoming this situation, but as was already told, we still see an increasing number of people being infected with the virus. So we cannot be optimistic yet, but still, when we talk about the trade in the recovery phase, Japan, EU trade, and when we see the data, and that data, and also the retail data in Japan, we took a look at from the European countries. There were, a great drops in the high-end luxury products, jewelries and bags coming from Europe because you know, it is in Japan, the people will go to the retail stores actually and then look at the goods and buy those luxury items. So on this sector, the effect will probably last longer than others. But when I actually took a look at the situation, the senior citizens who would usually buy these luxurious items, they refrain from going out in Japan. But the younger people who are now buying more in the entry-level goods. So there is some silver lining there. From the Japanese side, from Japan to Europe, because of this, you know, prolonged situation in Europe that, of course, has a negative impact, but there is also a positive effect in case the closures of factories in Europe continue going forward. Then, in terms of producing the same level of quality of goods that are produced in Europe, then Japan, especially the SMEs in Japan, with the strong competitiveness, maybe for them it is an opportunity for them to develop the international markets. So from the viewpoint of the customers, as was pointed out, diversification, diversify the supply chain, and Japan can be one choice in that diversification efforts. Lastly, so the relationship between supply chain and protectionism, and then whether Japan is going to, you know, choose the reshoring or not. And the surging protectionism in terms of Japan, as long as I talk with my clients, I don't see such a tendency of protectionism. The medical equipment and medical goods, there was restrictions of export. According to WTO, 80 countries, including the EU, instituted such restrictions, but Japan did not do that. Japan was committed to the free trade. And from the client's perspectives, although there are some moves in Europe to start producing those medical goods, but there is no tendency where European countries will just keep their goods within Europe. But everywhere there is a tendency to start reviewing the supply chain. And on the slide, you can see that on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, I should have explained this. This is the periodic survey with the companies. The companies of certain size, and we have been taking this survey periodically, like their willingness in the M&A, appetite for M&A, and then we are making a global comparison. And according to this survey, 50% of the companies responded that they are taking steps to change their supply chain. But what does this review of the supply chain mean? Can you go to the next slide? This is not a simple reassuring. I'm sorry, so diversifying the production sites and the sourcing places. So in that sense, reshoring is possible. The government subsidies are provided here in Japan, but it's not a very strong tendency. On the other hand, even before even before the COVID, now we had a local consumption and local production tendency, which was becoming increasingly clear, narrowing the distances between the production site and the consumption sites. So the production sources and the consumption sites, they are also globally connected. So the worldwide restructuring and the localized, when there is a localized disaster happening, for example, then the other production sites can cover that up. So what does it mean to be connected globally? For example, between Europe and Japan, there is a standardization of parts. So when Japan is hit hard, then the Europe can cover up, and then we can also outsource the parts manufacturing, and we can also create the digital twins. So the virtual monitoring of the factories can be possible. It's like, you know, all the factories in the world, anywhere in the world, can be monitored virtually. So when we think about that for the EU, in terms of the long-term perspectives, there is no reason for you to be pessimistic because you can also develop the business environment here in Japan that would benefit Europe. So that's it for me, and at least for this time.
Absolutely. Kobayashi-san, thank you very much. To the audience, I forgot to mention that Kobayashi-san is also a member of a board member of the German Chamber of Commerce. And I'm only mentioning this because the German Chamber of Commerce is also part of the seminar today. It's been very good helping to organize the seminar. Okay, Kobayashi-san, thank you very much also to you. If I may, now we got 30 minutes roughly. I will throw a question to the panelists, one question, and then I would like to ask you to answer briefly that question, and then we finally move to the audience, you know, having maybe 24, 25 minutes left. Can I start with Stephanie Lloyd? Stephanie, hi again. You're still there, of course, yeah? Okay, yeah. You talked about, in your presentation, you talked about EU-Japan joint efforts to counter protectionism. You know, can you maybe elaborate on this a bit more? You know, what are the EU and Japan doing already, and what could they be doing to counter protectionism? And maybe this is also a little bit already also Kobayashi's territory. The question I have for Hosuk is really towards the end of your presentation. You mentioned EU-Japan cooperation on integrating ASEAN, Japan being the natural leader or the national Asian point of reference for ASEAN countries, you know, in competition with China always, but Japan really the natural ally. What do you think could the EU and Japan be doing jointly, concretely on the ground in Asia to foster ASEAN integration? You know, in that case, probably economic and financial integration. Number two. Minister Okochi, you talked about strengthening EU-Japan coordination in various sectors now affected by the crisis, using the EPA as an instrument. What do you think? What aspects or what part of the EPA in particular will be useful, you know, to tackle the issues that or tackle some of the issues you mentioned in your presentation? Now, is the EPA the perfect instrument, you think, to address many of those issues? It's my question. Last question to Kobayashi-san. Reshoring, you know, bringing production back to Japan, maybe reducing, you know, dependency on China and other countries. And you talked about Japanese government involvement. How sustainable, how active do you think that is? How willing is the Japanese government, you know, in 6 months, in a year, maybe when the crisis is over, to invest resources and capital into reshoring, if there is to be more reshoring? Stephanie, can I give you the floor to answer, and then we go down the line? Ladies first.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Many thanks, Axel. And I would say, to reply to your question on what can the EU and Japan do more together in order to to counter or fight protectionism, I think the very first thing is obviously leading by example. So I often said a good trade policy starts at home, but I think that's very important. The previous speaker mentioned as well that we had, Japan has not put up export restrictions, for example. That is a very good example. I would also like to use this opportunity maybe to for a bit more positive nuance on what Hosuk said about the war in Europe and how everybody was trying to fight for themselves. I would at least say yes, that was, and I think I acknowledged that in the beginning by saying I think it's part of the nature of the crisis, of being a health crisis, that we were just not prepared for, that everybody started looking inward. But I think the European Union has been actually a good example from that very first scramble to move out of it into a much more coordinated approach. I think member states have quickly realized that the strength lies in their cooperation. We have seen good examples of mutual support and of the benefits of that afterwards. So I think and that stems from joint procurement matters, to lifting the barriers, to having patients from France being hospitalized in Germany and Italians as well, and so on. So I think there's plenty of examples that actually showed, I think, after this very first maybe moment of shock, which led us a little bit in the wrong way. I think we got out of it, and I hope also that, obviously you call the Corona bonds, that new recovery plan by the Commission, that is not yet agreed. But I'm very hopeful. I think there is a momentum of showing solidarity, of knowing that each member state will only recover as well as all the others will recover. And I think that same is actually true also globally. We know that we need the world to recover, for Europe to recover. And I think you put many examples up there of how dependent actually the EU is on trade. But what more can we do so then together? I think it's clearly the exerting leadership in the G20, for example, as I think it's the one forum right now where we have a rather global coordination. But the problem is that the interests there are so diverse. It is very difficult right now to come to actually statements that go much beyond the very first one that we've had. But I think we can only try with the like-minded countries, and that is the EU and Japan, but there's others out there. In WTO, we often call a bit the middle grounders, the like-minded. We have the Ottawa group that came out with a further action plan, also then to strengthen and resurrect the WTO. And I think that is obviously where we need jointly, the EU and Japan, to exert our leadership and try to push for a WTO reform. We know all very much that this will depend also on the engagement of the two key players, and in particular the conflict between the US and China, and whether we manage to convince both of them that it's worth to stay within the system. Which I think for China, it's clear that they want to stay within the system, but they need to understand that they will need to make another down payment if they want to stay in there. And the US, we're trying to convince that it's within the system that we can find solutions to obviously the underlying tensions and the problems that we acknowledge. So I think really trying to show leadership, joint proposals, building on the trilateral work that we've done with the US and Japan on industrial subsidies and other subjects, on transparency, and trying to fuel that into the WTO, to fuel the WTO reform, which I think probably likely to have different phases. We can now also build, and I haven't mentioned that yet, but the EU is also keen on a health initiative in the WTO, multilaterally, plurilaterally, to not just liberalize tariffs on health products, but also look at further disciplining particular issues like export restrictions. Very sensitive subject, but I think showcasing our understanding that we need more global cooperation, we need stable rules, we need to rebuild trust, basically. That is essentially what is there, and that is not easy, and it will not be easy as long as we still stay virtual. I think it's also something that will need people meeting again and getting together. So there we can certainly build, and I think that's important. I think Hosuk said it very well, that the EU-Japan agreement is about much more than the economics about it. It's really about having stronger pillars to our natural alliance and having a clear framework for further cooperation, which I think we need to use precisely to also leverage it then in the multilateral fora. And I maybe leave it there, because on the reshoring and else, I think you've put the questions already to others.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your further explanation. Hosso, do you want to very briefly, please address the ASEAN question and how we can better integrate ASEAN? I mean, we as in EU and Japan.
Yeah, sure. Before I do, I want to apologize for the audience, because I know that when Europeans appear on a panel together, they tend to talk about Europe and nothing else. But I will apologize for this, and by saying that I'm very grateful for Stephanie's answer. First, because we acknowledge that there is a crisis, but I would like to be very, very firm on the point that in my intervention, my point was to acknowledge that Europe is the solution. And from there, I would like to move on. I talked about the dependency on China, and there are many dimensions to this. And one is, of course, the dependency on China-made PPEs and protective gear, and that showed us how vulnerable we are. And we also should have seen in the last couple of years how dependent Europe is on digital infrastructure from China. And in many regards, I think whether you're looking at sourcing products or future growth opportunities, Europe's dependency on exporting will not go away, not in 1 year, not in 2 years. And if we are going to transition, it's going to be very, very hurtful. And when we are hurt, other economies like Japan, who depend on mutual exchange with us, will suffer too. So in other words, it is very important to look jointly for a new major market. Now here I need to be a little bit humble and say that actually ASEAN as a growth market has been known for the Japanese business for decades. But at the same time, our businessmen in much higher degree than our Japanese audience will think, missed the entire ASEAN boom. They came to China, they never moved on. They never went to the growth boom that appeared in Vietnam 7-8 years ago. They are not going into Indonesia now. And as the dependency of a new major market is going to be apparent, we only have two choices. If the China door is closed, we only have ASEAN or India. And in both legs, I think it's very clear that if Europe is going to continue to export capital goods like cars, machinery, infrastructure equipment, the door is going to be closed in China for a very long time for two reasons. They have their own domestic producers. Second is that they have built their last bridge that goes to nowhere. At some point, the demand for these kind of products that Europe wants to export will cease to exist in China. And this is the reason why I think we have a joint interest in combining our capital and as well as our ability to reintegrate markets. Europe certainly has a long experience in building single market, but we are looking at a cluster that could be an alternative to Chinese growth. In short, I mean, if you put Japan and ASEAN together, actually in terms of GDP and consumption, that really matters. It's bigger than China for Europe. And this is a message that I would like to repeat to our audience in Europe from time to time, and also for European business in Tokyo to realize that Tokyo is a regional hub. It's not just about the Japanese market. And on a final point, I think there's also political cooperation that is very important, and that goes beyond ASEAN. And I think a lot of foreign policy observers are currently looking at the EU-Japan SPA and the relationship and starting to ask themselves, what does it mean to be a partner for Europe? And that also means to reiterate some of the points that Stephanie and other people have brought out in this conversation. And I think also that Okochi-san did a very good overview of all the potential there is in the relationship in different negotiation tracks. But there is also a more fundamental one. Partners means showing up. We talked about the WTO process, for example. It means that Europe should not support a candidate that wants to do Japan harm and vice versa. Thank you.
Okay, Also, thank you very much for this again. Shall I move on to Minister Okochi? Over to you, EU-Japan. What else can be done? Very briefly, if I may. And I've got some good news. I've just been authorized by my friends and colleagues in the European delegation, EU delegation Tokyo, that we have additional 5 to 10 minutes. So there's no rush. I mean, not an invitation to talk too much, but we have a bit more time. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you very much. I'd like to speak in Japanese. Japan, EU, EPA, this is very important, and the question is regarding that importance. And I think the two previous speakers have already touched upon that question, but I'd like to make the following point. EPA is about rules, it's about tariffs, but EPA is also about a variety of cooperation channels and also negotiation channels being opened up. Joint meeting is one, foreign ministers, and also commissioner in charge of trade in EU. There is a regular meeting being held, and 12 technical meetings or working groups are being set up, and they actually come together every year face to face. So this is a high level structure as well as the expert level structure. It opens up opportunity for interaction at many different levels. This is a very important framework to overcome this crisis of COVID-19. And I'd like to talk about another thing, which is about supply chain, how to enhance supply chain, and how can we enhance our relationship with ASEAN. I'd like to talk about just one thing. Just the other day in the Diet, we had an approval about the economic package. And in this package, the government announced support and assistance to those companies which try to enhance supply chain. And the amount is around 240 billion yen, which is around 2 million euros. So if companies want to diversify their supply chain, they will be supported by the government. And of course, this includes enhanced relationship with ASEAN. This is going to play a very important role going forward. So this is going to be tried out. So that's something I wanted to introduce to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Okochi-san. Kobayashi-san, last but not least, over to you on reshoring and Japanese support for what could be additional reshoring in the month ahead. Over to you. Take your time. You know.
Sure. そうですね。大河内さんの最後のコメントにもあったんです。
The last part, the Minister Okochi pointed out, in terms of reshoring, and as long as I see from the business perspective, if there is an economic reasonableness from the point of view of the corporations, then that makes sense. And the Japanese government has taken a soft approach. It's not that they are enforcing the companies to do the reshoring. That's not the approach that the government has taken. Then why? What kind of reshoring? Why reshoring? Talk about reshoring, and when reshoring occurs. The scenario in which reshoring occurs, I think there are 4 cases. One is there are 2 are state-driven, and the other 2 are private sector-driven. And what about the state-driven? One is not related to COVID, not directly, in terms of the security. But China and the US has had tensions like the semiconductors and other sectors, because that is related to national security, so the production should occur within the company. But this is the area where Japan doesn't really have any concern, because Japanese companies tend to have a more refined technologies. So reshoring this is not the reshoring driver for Japan. The second state-driven reshoring move is indeed accelerated by COVID-19. That is to secure the medical supplies, otherwise the people's health cannot be protected. But again, Japan did not see any reshoring tendency in this, and rather there was a case where Japan was exporting such equipment. And what about the private sector driven scenarios? Reshoring is one means in diversifying the supply chain, especially when the final processing occurs in Japan and the products are offered to Japanese clients, or whether they are lightweighted, then the final process occurs in Japan. Then the probably prior processes can also take place in Japan. So that's one. And right now, with the deeper penetration of automation, we no longer has the labor cost arbitrage. So that means that the people can get their production back into Japan. But this is not just about Japan, and the ASEAN can also do the same. So probably such a private sector driven measures can be supported by government subsidies. Lastly, and this is about the second slide of my presentation, and this is my specialty area, so I'm going to talk in more detail. We suppose that the Japanese consumers would like to use more Japan-made products, Japanese brand, and Ernst & Young did do this consumer studies in different countries, including Japan. And one of the results from the survey, Japanese consumers, as compared to Chinese and US consumers, they tend to think the made in Japan is rather good. Japanese people like the Japan-made products. So for such products, the companies may choose to produce those in Japan, but changing the supply chain and making the investment in factories would be enormous in amount and the long term. And long term, we cannot expect the Japanese consumption market will grow. And also the quality of goods produced in Japan is improving. So I don't know how long this made in Japan tendency will last in Japan. So from these reasons, I do not think that the reassuring will be a major tendency.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kobayashi-san. Thank you very much for your contribution also. Now we have not a lot of time, apologies for that, but we have some time to finally, and I apologize to the still 276 participants of this seminar. Thank you, by the way, for staying. We will get back to you. Now, there are a number of questions. I will have to cherry pick a few. The first question is maybe directed to Hosuk. Maybe he's the person who can answer that question very briefly, if you can. The $1 trillion question. When do you think, Hosuk, is one participant asking, could the EU-Japan return to trade volume levels of 2019 if, let's say, we're able to overcome the crisis relatively quickly now? Or if things are going better as opposed to getting better? When do you think will we see the same level of bilateral trade between the EU and Japan?
Well, I could try to guess a date and say, and you can always say on that date that, haha, Maki was wrong. So that's why all economists say it depends. But I'm actually going to be bold and say that I hope that it never returns to the same volume. Let me explain why. I don't think trade volumes are relevant in a COVID world. I hope that our relationship transition into a relationship that is more dependent on investment. So therefore, we are seeing now a development, and particularly Europe is graduating from an export-led model where we build at home, ship abroad, to actually invest in the economies that have higher growth. And there's one point I want to mention here, that actually, when I look at the return of investment numbers of foreign overseas markets outside of Europe, European investments in Japan are actually performing extremely well, much better than actually in other Asian economies. That is actually quite telling that we don't need to have growth at home. We can actually, as long as we have open economies like Japan that we can invest on. And I recently heard from a European, a major tech company, that they are actually leaving now their current location in Shenzhen, moving to possibly to Japan, because actually Japan is cheaper. I'd never thought that in my lifetime, even pre or post bubble, that Japan would be a low-cost alternative, and it offers a lot of return in terms of R&D and also secondary positive effects. And the same equation goes the other way around. Europe is, yes, it's going to be a zero growth area for a very long time, but we have some structural changes that is offering Japanese company a major benefit. And therefore, we have over 100,000 people working for Japanese companies across Europe. It's actually one of our biggest employers. So I hope that development is continuing rather than actually shipping goods back and forth, because that is good, but that's not actually a measurement of how strong the relationship is.
Okay, thank you very much. So there is a silver lining after all. Thank you for this. Yeah, I want to. Yeah, that's very nice of you. Well, it's not very nice of you. These are the facts. Very much appreciated. A question maybe directed at our two officials, Stephanie and Akihiro. It's a question on in the forum on EU-Japan talks on e-commerce, healthcare, and other issues in the WTO framework. Do you think that the current crisis and the current situation will provide the EU and Japan with additional incentives and additional urgency to coordinate respective positions within the WTO framework on, for example, e-commerce and healthcare and other issues? Can I give Stephanie the word first, Okochi-san, and then over to you? Okay, good. Stephanie, go ahead.
Thank you. I think a very short reply on that one would be yes. But I think indeed both examples that were mentioned there, e-commerce and health issues, a health initiative, as I outlined before, are clearly initiatives that can also maybe now in a very first phase, help the WTO to be reinvigorated a little bit with this impetus that stems from the crisis. I think clearly e-commerce, we have seen the importance. We're still missing the rules for that. I think the minister also already mentioned, obviously, the importance of agreeing for the rules on data flows in a balance with privacy there, which will be an important part. And I think, again, also on health products, we'll have to see how much, I think, impetus we can now keep from that crisis, where we've seen the need for keeping global supply chains open, whether that can help actually tackle such a, in the end, and still sensitive project, where I think you need a good equilibrium as well between, on the one hand side, as I said, just the tariff liberalization, which is in the interest of some, and then also more disciplines on export restrictions, which will actually then increase the interest for everybody in that game. So I think yes, if we can use our partnership to promote these two areas and try to advance on them, I think that could be a helpful starting signal for more successful negotiations within the WTO.
Okay, Stephanie, thank you very much. Okochi-san, do you want to comment as well, please?
ステファニー、ありがとうございました。では、大越さんお願いできますか?
Okay, we have to turn on his microphone. Yep. All right, you got the message.
So just I'd like to emphasize that we have been working very much closely with EU during this pandemic period, not only on the data flow, but also on the WHO reform. So I can assure you that we are on the same boat and we are working very much closely with the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I've got a question for maybe Kobayashi-san, if you, I would like to challenge you a little bit. And well, the participants are challenging us a little bit. One of the participants is asking, how come the stock markets are back to record levels? How come, you know, the crisis, the current economic crisis, economic depression, if you will, decreased trade flows are not being reflected in the stock markets? Why have they recovered so quickly? Is that because of the stimulus, or is it because of something else? What do you think, Kobayashi-san? Or are we all speculators?
Yeah, that's a very big question. 一番難しい質問ですね。これだけ
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. You know, there is such a wide gap between the two, and I feel uncomfortable. The reason why is that the you know, the money you know, has no places to go. And then another factor is that the optimism, thinking that maybe this COVID crisis is over. And then someone, you know, took on that positive news and then replace it with their, you know, cash flow. But depending on the sector, there are differences. And if this is a technology sector, they, you know, their sales have grown and their user size has grown. So there is a rationale in certain aspects, but overall, now we see too extensive tendency. So at some timing in the future, because you know, a lot of countries now are in debt, and they will have to you know, increase the taxes. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think this is positive, because if the money has nowhere else to go, then the stock markets might remain stable. Not that I have much money to invest into the stock market, but if I had a lot of money, I would be content with your reply to this. Now, what do we do now? Shall we take one more question? Go a little bit beyond the 11 o'clock, maybe another 5 minutes. We still have 244 participants. I think this is an invitation to place one more question. Let me see what I have. Yeah, something I'm just reading this out because I don't fully understand what I will be reading out now, but I try. And this is maybe addressed to all of you. Now, what we have mentioned in the beginning, or what was mentioned by Hosoga, so the nations, everybody fighting for himself, him or herself, and the problems we saw with the provision of masks and the problems related to standards and regulations. Is that a lesson? Is there a lesson to learn for the EU and Japan on mutual recognition of standards? So I do understand what I'm saying. Now I do. Is there a lesson to be learned for the EU and Japan as regards the mutual recognition of standards? Is the EPA, let's put it this way, is the EPA fully equipped to master such a situation where a quick and efficient mutual recognition of standards is required, and not the kind of course, the problem was not between the EU and Japan, but between European countries and other countries. Is there more we can do in terms of mutual recognition of standards in order to avoid the problems we had with the provision of medical supplies? Who wants to answer that? Stephanie, do you have something to say on this?
As I would have mentioned what just one of the participants actually already put in the chat, that, you know, one of the responses that we did was that we made the standards available for free, that we opened them up. I mean, it clearly did show, I think, the crisis that yes, there is. I mean, regulatory cooperation is important. I think that is something that is already also fairly well rooted in the EU-Japan FTA. As an important issue for further cooperation, but it's because it's a very delicate matter. Right? You're weighing. You have your own system. You need to see where can you go for equivalency, or where can you mutual recognition, whatever you would have as a system, to ensure that you still fulfill your own legitimate public policy objectives, usually then security of the products or else, while at the same time facilitating that you don't have to do the testing again, or that the standards are actually equivalent. So I think it's clearly one of the issues where even beyond, I think EU and Japan are well equipped to further work on this, but I think even going broader, trying to enhance regulatory cooperation would be very beneficial. That was also, it was a big component also for the transatlantic partnership at the time that we then did not manage further, but I think it's clearly that is at the heart of many of the frictions otherwise. Okay. But also a very delicate subject, I think, overall, because it goes to the heart as how you want to regulate, how a society wants to regulate and promote its product.
Of course. Okay, now thank you very much, Stephanie. I think it is time to close. Thank you very much to all of you, to our panelists, to all of the participants. Very much appreciated. I see a lot of people are still online. Thank you very much. All of us, of course, are looking forward to seeing each other in person at some point in the near future. Thank you also, of course, to the European Union, to the EU delegation in Tokyo for making this possible. Thank you also to my friend at the Spanish consultancy in charge of this webinar series, Antonio. Thank you very much to Pablo in Tokyo, to Yamamoto-san, of course, in Tokyo, the coordinator of the EU-Japan SPA. Massive project. I think it was a very, very good seminar. I think we had a wide range being discussed here. Lots of questions. Apologies to the participants that I was not able to answer nearly, or that we were not able to answer nearly all of them. There will be more seminars like this, and we are very much looking forward to seeing many of you again in the next seminar. Thank you very much again to all of you, and with this I would like to close, and please enjoy the rest of your day or night wherever you are. Thank you very much. Goodbye.